The dust kicked up around Maria Hayes's worn boots as she stood frozen in the doorway of Patterson's general store, the shopkeeper's words still ringing in her ears like a slap across the face. She had walked 3 miles under the blazing Colorado sun just to buy flour and coffee. And now, Henry Patterson stood behind his counter with his arms crossed, his face twisted into something ugly and unmovable, telling her that her money was no good here, that he did not serve women who lived alone on the outskirts of town without a husband or father to make them respectable. It was June of 1878, and Colorado City sat nestled at the base of Pikes Peak, a growing town where the railroad brought both opportunity and judgment in equal measure. Maria had inherited her small ranch from her uncle 8 months ago when fever took him suddenly, leaving her with 40 acres, a dozen cattle, and a reputation that had somehow become tarnished simply because she was a 22-year-old woman trying to survive on her own. The other women in town whispered about her when she passed, and now it seemed that whisper campaign had reached Patterson's ears, poisoning whatever basic human decency he might have once possessed. "I said get out," Patterson repeated, his jowls quivering with self-righteous indignation. "I do not need your kind driving away my respectable customers." Maria's hands trembled as she clutched her small purse, the coins inside suddenly worthless. She wanted to argue, to defend herself against accusations that had never been spoken aloud but hung in the air like smoke, but her throat had closed up with humiliation. "2 other customers in the store, Mrs. Albright and her daughter watched with barely concealed satisfaction, as though Maria's public shaming somehow elevated their own standing. She turned to leave, blinking back tears that she refused to let fall where anyone could see them, when a voice cut through the thick atmosphere like a knife through butter. "How much do you want for this store?" Maria stopped, her hand on the doorframe, and turned to see a man she had never noticed before. He must have been standing in the back corner examining saddles, because he seemed to materialize out of nowhere, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, his boots dusty from the trail, but something in the way he carried himself suggested he was more than just another ranch hand passing through town. Patterson's face went from red to purple. "What kind of fool question is that?" "A serious one." The cowboy walked forward with an easy confidence, his spurs chinking softly against the wooden floor. "You have just turned away a paying customer, which tells me you care more about your personal prejudices than running a successful business. So I figure you might be willing to sell to someone who actually knows what he is doing." "This store has been in my family for 15 years, Patterson sputtered. "I would never sell to some drifter who wanders in off the street." The cowboy reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a leather wallet from which he extracted a bank draft. He laid it on the counter with a soft thud. "That is a draft for $8,000 from the First National Bank of Denver. My name is Mason Calloway Drake, and I am not a drifter. I sold my cattle operation in Wyoming last month and have been looking for a new investment. This store sits on a prime location with the railroad depot 2 blocks away, and the building itself is worth at least half that amount. The inventory might add another $2,000 if it is well maintained. So I am offering you $8,000 for everything, the building, the stock, and the business name. You can take it or leave it, but the offer expires the moment I walk out that door." The silence that fell over the store was so complete that Maria could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She stood rooted to the spot, unable to process what was happening. Patterson's face had gone from purple to white, his eyes fixed on the bank draft as though it were a rattlesnake coiled on his counter. That is ridiculous, Patterson finally managed. This store is worth twice that amount. Then you should have no trouble finding another buyer, Mason said calmly. But we both know that is not true. Your inventory is poorly organized, half your stock is outdated, and from what I observed in the 10 minutes I have been here, your customer service is abysmal. 8,000 is a generous offer, and you know it. Mrs. Albright had pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Her daughter tugged at her sleeve, whispering something urgent, but Mrs. Albright seemed too stunned to move. Maria felt equally paralyzed, watching this stranger dismantle Patterson's empire with nothing but calm logic and a bank draft. Patterson's hands shook as he reached for the paper, examining it closely as though hoping to find proof of forgery. But the draft was legitimate, embossed with the bank's official seal, and his shoulders slowly sagged in defeat. "I want 8,500, he said weakly. 8,000, Mason repeated. "And I want an answer in the next 30 seconds, because I just remembered there is another general store for sale over in Manitou Springs, and the owner there is probably not fool enough to turn away customers based on gossip." "Fine," Patterson spat out the word like poison. 8,000. "But I want it in cash, and I want the sale finalized today." "Agreed. We will go to the bank right now and complete the transaction. I assume you have the deed to the property." Patterson nodded stiffly, already untying his apron with jerky, angry movements. He disappeared into the back room and emerged with a locked metal box which he tucked under his arm. "Let us get this over with," he muttered. Mason turned to Maria, who still stood frozen in the doorway, and his expression softened. "Miss, would you mind waiting here for about an hour? I have some business to attend to, but when I return, I would very much like you to be my first customer." Maria found her voice at last, though it came out barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" "Because some things are more important than money," Mason said simply. "And because I cannot stand to see a man abuse whatever small power he has been given in this world." He tipped his hat to her, then gestured for Patterson to lead the way out. The moment the two men left, Mrs. Albright and her daughter erupted into scandalized whispers, but Maria ignored them. She moved to one of the chairs near the cold pot bellied stove and sat down before her shaking legs could give out beneath her. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. A complete stranger had just purchased an entire store simply because the owner had refused to serve her. It seemed like something out of a dime novel, too dramatic to be real, and yet she was sitting in the middle of it. The other two women eventually left, probably racing to spread the news throughout the town, and Maria found herself alone in the store. She looked around at the shelves packed with goods, the barrels of flour and sugar, the jars of penny candy on the counter, the farming tools hanging from the walls. This had been Patterson's kingdom, the place where he held court and passed judgment on everyone who needed supplies. And now it belonged to a stranger who had appeared like an avenging angel. Almost exactly an hour later, the door opened and Mason walked in, now holding a ring of keys and a rolled-up deed. His expression was satisfied, like a man who had just concluded a successful business negotiation. Behind him, she could see a small crowd gathering on the street, people craning their necks to peer through the windows. "Miss Hayes," he said, and she realized she had never told him her name. He must have asked someone. "I am now the official owner of this establishment, and you were waiting here first, which makes you my first customer. What can I help you find today?" Maria stood up, her emotions a tangled mess of gratitude, confusion, and something else she could not quite name. "I needed flour and coffee," she said, "but I cannot let you buy an entire store just because someone was cruel to me. That is insane." Mason walked behind the counter, settling into the space that Patterson had occupied just an hour before. "I did not buy this store just for that reason," he said. "Though I will admit it was the catalyst. I have been looking for a business investment in Colorado for the past 3 weeks. I spent time in Denver, but the city is too crowded for my taste. I came down here to Colorado City because I heard it was growing steadily, and I wanted something in a smaller community. I was actually in here pricing out the inventory when you walked in." He paused, his gray eyes meeting hers directly. "What Patterson did to you was unforgivable, but it also showed me exactly what kind of man he was, and it made my decision easy. A store is only as good as the community it serves, and I intend to serve everyone fairly." "That is a very expensive point to make," Maria said, but she felt the tightness in her chest beginning to ease. "Perhaps. But I can afford it, and now I own a profitable business in a good location. So really, everyone wins except Patterson, and frankly, he does not deserve to win." Mason reached under the counter and pulled out a large apron, which he tied around his waist. The gesture was so matter-of-fact and incongruous with his earlier display of wealth that Maria felt a surprised laugh bubble up in her throat. "You are really going to run this store yourself?" she asked. "Until I hire proper help, yes. I am not afraid of work, Miss Hayes. I built my cattle operation from nothing, starting as a ranch hand when I was 15 years old. I know how to keep books, manage inventory, and deal with customers. This will not be that different, just with less mud and fewer ornery steers." He pulled out a pad of paper and a pencil. "Now, you said you needed flour and coffee. How much of each?" Maria told him her order, and he moved through the store with surprising efficiency, gathering the items and weighing them out. As he worked, she studied him more closely. He was probably around 30 years old, with the lean, weathered look of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors. His hands were calloused and scarred, the hands of someone who knew physical labor, but he moved with a natural grace that suggested he was equally comfortable in more refined settings. When he had assembled her order, he wrote out the total on the pad. The price was fair, exactly what Patterson would have charged without any markup or discount. Maria appreciated that. She did not want charity, just basic respect. As she counted out her coins, Mason said, "I hope you will not think me too forward, but I would like to know more about what happened here today. Is Patterson the only merchant who has refused to serve you?" Maria's face heated with embarrassment. "No, though he is the most blatant about it. The baker's wife watches me like a hawk when I come in, and she always claims to be out of whatever I ask for first. The seamstress refuses to take my measurements, saying she is too busy with other customers. Most people in town have decided that a woman living alone on a ranch must be morally questionable, even though I have done nothing wrong except inherit property." "Your uncle was Edward Hayes?" Mason asked, surprising her again with his knowledge. "Yes. Did you know him?" "I met him once, about 2 years ago at a cattle auction in Denver. He struck me as a good man, very straightforward in his dealings. He spoke about his ranch and mentioned he had a niece back east who was teaching school." Mason's expression was thoughtful. "I am sorry for your loss. Thank you. He was more of a father to me than my own ever was. When he wrote asking me to come help him run the ranch, I did not hesitate. And when he died, I could not bring myself to leave the place he built, but I have been paying for that decision ever since." Maria picked up her packages, holding them close to her chest. "I should go. Thank you for this, for all of it. You did not have to stand up for me, but I am grateful that you did. Miss Hayes, wait." Mason came around the counter, his expression serious. "I know we have just met, and I know this whole situation must seem very strange to you, but I would like to ask your permission to call on you properly. I would like to get to know you better if you are willing." Maria's heart stuttered in her chest. She had not expected this, had not dared to hope for anything beyond this single moment of kindness. "You do not even know me," she said carefully. "What if all the things people say about me are true?" "Are they true?" Mason asked directly. "No, I live alone because I have no other choice. I work hard to keep my ranch running. I go to church every Sunday, though no one will sit in my pew. I have never done anything to deserve the reputation this town has given me." Maria lifted her chin defiantly. "But I cannot prove any of that to you." "You do not have to prove anything," Mason said quietly. "I am a fairly good judge of character, Miss Hayes. I have dealt with all kinds of people in my life, from honest ranch hands to con men who could sell water to a fish. What I saw today was a woman who walked 3 miles in the heat to buy basic supplies, who held her head up even when being publicly humiliated, and who did not break down or cause a scene even though she would have been justified in doing so. That tells me more about your character than any amount of gossip." Maria felt tears prick her eyes again, but this time they were not tears of humiliation. "I do not know what to say. Say yes to letting me call on you. Say yes to having dinner with me tomorrow night at the hotel restaurant. Say yes to giving me a chance to prove that not everyone in this town has lost their common sense and decency." Mason's voice was earnest, his gray eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Yes," Maria heard herself say. "Yes to all of it." The smile that broke across Mason's face transformed him from handsome to devastating. "Then I will pick you up at your ranch tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock. Will that give you enough time to finish your work for the day?" "Yes, that should be fine. Do you know where the Hayes Ranch is?" "I will find it," Mason assured her. "In a town this size, everyone knows where everything is, even the places they pretend do not exist." Maria felt an answering smile tug at her lips. "That is certainly true." She shifted her packages in her arms. "I really should go now. I have a long walk ahead of me. You walked here. You do not have a wagon or a horse. I have both, but my wagon lost a wheel last week and I have not had time to fix it yet. My horse threw a shoe yesterday, and the blacksmith told me he was too busy to see me for another week." Maria said this matter-of-factly, as though such obstacles were simply part of her daily life. Mason's jaw tightened. "Wait here for just a moment." He disappeared into the back room and emerged with a canvas bag, into which he began packing her supplies. "I am taking you home in my wagon. I need to see the surrounding area anyway, to get a better sense of the community I am now serving. And while we are at it, I can take a look at your wagon wheel and see if it is something I can repair." "You do not have to do that," Maria protested, even as her tired feet silently thanked him for the offer. "I know I do not have to. I want to. There is a difference." Mason finished packing her supplies, added a few items she had not asked for, and held up his hand when she started to object. "Consider it a welcoming gift for my first customer. Now, let me lock up the store and we can be on our way." 20 minutes later, Maria sat beside Mason on the bench of a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 well-matched bay horses. The wagon was well-made and clearly expensive, like everything else about Mason Drake. As they rolled out of town, she was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them, but for once she did not care. Let them talk. Let them speculate. For the first time in 8 months, she felt like she had an ally. The road to her ranch wound through rolling grassland dotted with scrub oak and juniper, with Pike's Peak rising majestically to the west. The late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, and a light breeze took the edge off the heat. Mason handled the team with practiced ease, occasionally pointing out landmarks and asking her questions about the area. "How many acres did your uncle have?" he asked. 40, with water rights to a creek that runs through the north section. It is not a large operation, but the land is good and the water is reliable. Uncle Edward ran about 50 head of cattle, but I have sold off most of them. I am down to a dozen now, just enough to maintain the herd until I can figure out what I am doing. Maria looked out at the landscape, feeling the familiar mix of love and overwhelming responsibility that the ranch inspired in her. "I grew up in Boston, Mr. Drake. I taught literature to young ladies at a private school. I did not know the first thing about ranching when I came here, and I am still learning. Call me Mason, please. And for what it is worth, I think you are doing remarkably well considering the circumstances. Losing your uncle, taking over a ranch alone, dealing with a hostile community, any one of those things would be enough to break most people. The fact that you are still standing tells me you have steel in your spine. Or maybe just stubbornness," Maria said with a slight smile. "My mother always said I was too stubborn for my own good. Stubborn is just another word for determined, and determination is a virtue out here. The West is not kind to people who give up easily." Mason glanced at her. "What made you leave Boston? Besides your uncle's invitation, I mean." "That is a long way to travel for a teaching position." Maria was quiet for a moment, weighing how much to reveal. But something about Mason invited honesty, and she found herself telling him the truth. "I was engaged to be married." His name was Theodore, and he was a banker's son, very proper and respectable. We had been courting for 2 years, and everyone said we were a perfect match. But then, his father's bank invested in some risky ventures that failed. And suddenly, Theodore's family was not quite as wealthy as they had been. He decided that he needed to marry someone with a larger dowry, someone who could help restore his family's fortunes. So he broke our engagement and married a shipping magnate's daughter within 6 months. "He sounds like a fool," Mason said bluntly. "He was practical. That is what everyone said, that he was being practical and responsible to his family." Maria twisted her hands in her lap. "But it taught me that the life I thought I was building was all an illusion. Theodore never loved me. He loved the idea of a suitable wife who could host dinner parties and embroider cushions, and never cause him any trouble. When Uncle Edward wrote and asked if I wanted to come help him, I jumped at the chance. I thought I was running away, but actually, I was running toward something real. And now you are stuck with a real ranch and real problems and a town full of real judgmental fools," Mason said. "Life has a strange sense of humor sometimes." Maria laughed, surprised by his frankness. "That is certainly one way to put it." They fell into a comfortable silence as the wagon rolled on. Maria found herself stealing glances at Mason, trying to figure him out. He was unlike any man she had ever met, neither the stiff, formal gentleman of Boston nor the rough, crude cowboys she had encountered since coming to Colorado. He seemed to exist in some middle ground, comfortable with both physical labor and business negotiations, at ease with silence but capable of genuine conversation. When they reached her ranch, Mason helped her down from the wagon and then stood looking around with an appraising eye. The ranch house was small but well built, with a front porch that faced west toward the mountains. The barn was in good repair, and the corrals were sturdy. Everything showed signs of being maintained by someone who cared, even if that someone was clearly overwhelmed. "You have a good setup here," Mason said. "Your uncle built this place with care." "He did. He spent 15 years building it from nothing." Maria led him to where her wagon sat with one corner propped up on blocks, the broken wheel leaning against the side. "I know I need a new rim. The wood cracked when I hit a rock last week. I have been meaning to take it to the wheelwright, But the wheelwright probably gave you the same runaround as everyone else, Mason finished. He crouched down to examine the wheel, running his hands over the damage. This is not too bad. The hub and spokes are still good. You just need a new rim and some fresh iron, and I can do that for you. I will take this wheel back to town with me and bring it back repaired tomorrow when I come for dinner. Mason, you do not have to keep doing things for me, Maria said, though her heart warmed at his casual assumption that he would solve her problems. He stood up, brushing dust from his hands. I know I do not have to, but I want to, and I am stubborn too, remember. Now, show me where you keep your tools and let me look at that horse that needs shoeing. Maria showed him to the barn, where her uncle's old mare, Sadie, was munching hay in her stall. Mason examined the horse's hooves with the practiced touch of someone who had done this hundreds of times, then nodded. I can shoe her for you now if you have the equipment. You are a shopkeeper and a blacksmith, Maria asked incredulously. I am a rancher who learned to do everything himself because hiring help was too expensive when I was starting out. I have shod more horses than I can count, Miss Hayes. It is not as complicated as people make it out to be, as long as you are patient and the horse trusts you. He looked up at her from where he crouched beside Sadie's front hoof. Do you trust me? The question seemed to carry more weight than the simple words implied. Maria met his eyes and found herself saying, Yes, yes, I do. It took Mason about an hour to shoe all 4 of Sadie's hooves, working with quiet efficiency while Maria watched and handed him tools when he asked. The sun was sinking lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the evening air had cooled to something pleasant. When he finished, Mason led Sadie around the corral to make sure everything felt right, then nodded in satisfaction. She is all set. You should not have any more problems with her. He returned Sadie to her stall and hung up the tools. I should head back to town before it gets too dark. Thank you for letting me see your place, Miss Hayes. You have a good operation here, and I think your uncle would be proud of what you are doing with it. Thank you, Maria said softly. And thank you for everything today, for the store, for bringing me home, for fixing Sadie. I do not know how I will ever repay you for all of this. Mason stepped closer, and Maria's breath caught at the intensity in his eyes. I do not want repayment. I want to know you better. I want to understand what makes you brave enough to stay here when everything seems to be working against you. I want to hear more about your life in Boston and how you ended up teaching yourself to be a rancher. He stopped himself, shaking his head slightly. I am sorry. I am moving too fast. It is just that I feel like I have been looking for something without knowing what it was, and then I walked into that store today and saw you standing there, and something clicked into place. Maria's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. I know what you mean, she whispered. I felt it too. For a long moment they stood there in the gathering dusk, the air between them charged with possibility. Then Mason reached out and gently touched her cheek, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender. Tomorrow at 6, he said, I will be here. I will be ready, Maria promised. She watched from the porch as Mason drove away, the wagon disappearing down the road in a cloud of dust. Only when he was completely out of sight did she allow herself to lean against the porch railing, her knees suddenly weak. What had just happened? In the span of a few hours, her entire life had shifted. A stranger had bought a store to defend her honor, had asked to court her, had fixed her horse and promised to repair her wagon. It was overwhelming and wonderful and terrifying all at once. That night, Maria lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the day. She kept expecting to wake up and find it had all been a dream, some desperate fantasy conjured by her lonely mind. But morning came, and the flour and coffee Mason had sold her were still sitting on her kitchen table. real and solid proof that yesterday had actually happened. She spent the day in a flurry of nervous preparation, finishing her chores with unusual speed, then scrubbing herself clean and washing her hair in the big copper tub. She had exactly 2 good dresses, both of them practical and simple, and she chose the dark blue one that Uncle Edward had always said brought out the color of her eyes. She pinned her dark hair up carefully, allowing a few curls to frame her face, and studied herself in the small mirror above her dresser. She looked excited and nervous and hopeful, and she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. At precisely 6 o'clock, she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Maria took a deep breath, smoothed her skirt one last time, and walked out onto the porch. Mason had cleaned up as well, trading his dusty trail clothes for dark trousers and a crisp white shirt under a vest. His hair was still damp, as though he had dunked his head in a water barrel moments before arriving. He climbed down from the wagon with the repaired wheel propped in the back, and his face broke into that devastating smile when he saw her. "Miss Hayes, you look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you. You look very nice as well." Maria accepted his hand as he helped her up onto the wagon bench. "I see you managed to repair the wheel." "I did. I will install it for you later tonight when I bring you home, if that is all right." "I did not want to show up covered in grease and sawdust for our dinner." Mason settled beside her and took up the reins. "I hope you do not mind eating at the hotel restaurant. It is not fancy, but the food is decent, and it is the most respectable place in town." "I am sure it will be fine," Maria said, though her stomach fluttered nervously at the thought of walking into the hotel restaurant on Mason's arm. The gossip mill in Colorado City was probably already running at full speed, and their appearance together would only add fuel to the fire. As if reading her thoughts, Mason said, "I want you to know that I do not care what people say about us. Let them talk. Let them speculate. The truth is plain enough for anyone with eyes to see, and the people who choose not to see it are not worth your concern." "That is easy to say when you have not spent months being treated like a pariah," Maria said quietly. "I know I should not care what they think, but it hurts. It hurts to walk into church and have people shift away from me like I carry some contagious disease. It hurts to hear whispers cut off abruptly when I come around a corner, and it especially hurts to know that I have done nothing to deserve any of it except try to survive on my own." Mason reached over and covered her hand with his. "I know. And I am not going to pretend that having dinner with me will magically solve all of that. But maybe, just maybe, if people see that I respect you and value your company, some of them will start to question their own assumptions. And the ones who do not, well, they are not the kind of people whose respect is worth having anyway." The hotel restaurant was about half full when they arrived, and Maria felt every eye in the room turn toward them as Mason escorted her to a table by the window. She kept her head high, refusing to look around or acknowledge the stares. Mason held out her chair with perfect courtesy, then sat across from her, his body language relaxed and confident. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Dorothy who had always been coldly polite to Maria in the past, approached their table with visible curiosity. "Good evening, Mr. Drake. Miss Hayes, what can I get for you tonight?" Mason ordered for both of them roast beef with potatoes and vegetables, followed by apple pie, and Dorothy scurried away to relay the order to the kitchen. Maria could see her stopping to whisper urgently to another waitress, both of them glancing back at the table. "Let them stare," Mason said mildly. "They will get bored eventually." "You have a lot of faith in human nature," Maria said. "Not really. I just have a lot of experience ignoring people who are not worth my time." Mason leaned forward, his elbows on the table. Tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with ranching or this town. Tell me about Boston. Tell me about the books you taught. Tell me anything that will help me know who you really are." So Maria told him. She told him about growing up in a cramped apartment above her father's tailor shop, about how she had scrimped and saved to attend teacher's college, about the joy she had found in introducing young women to the works of Shakespeare and Austen and the Bront sisters. She told him about her mother, who had died when Maria was 15, and how her father had never quite recovered from the loss. She told him about the first time she had seen the ocean, about the smell of salt air and the sound of gulls, and how she had felt so small and insignificant standing on the shore. And Mason listened. He really listened, asking questions and making comments that showed he was not just being polite, but genuinely interested. In turn, he told her about growing up in Wyoming, about his father who had been a cavalry soldier and his mother who had died giving birth to him. He talked about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about working on various ranches from the time he was barely into his teens, about saving every penny until he had enough to buy a small piece of land and 10 head of cattle. "I built that operation for 12 years, Mason said, his voice tinged with something that might have been regret. "I poured everything I had into it, all my time, all my money, all my dreams, and it was successful. By the end, I had over 500 head and a good crew working for me. But somewhere along the way, I realized I was not happy. I was so focused on building something, on proving that I could succeed, that I forgot to actually live. I woke up one morning and realized I was 30 years old, and I had never been in love, never traveled anywhere that was not related to cattle, never read a book just for pleasure or spent an afternoon doing nothing. So I sold it all. I took my money and decided to start over, to build a different kind of life, one with room for more than just work." "And you think a general store in Colorado City is going to give you that?" Maria asked. "I think the store is just a place. What matters is what else I build around it." Mason held her gaze steadily. "I know this is fast. I know we just met yesterday, but I am not getting any younger, and I have learned that opportunities do not wait around for you to be ready. When you see something you want, something that feels right, you have to reach for it." "And what is it that you want?" Maria asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "I want you," Mason said simply. "I want to know everything about you. I want to court you properly, to take you to dinners and dances and anywhere else you want to go. I want to help you with your ranch and watch you succeed. And eventually, if you will have me, I want to marry you and build a life together that neither of us could have built alone." Maria's breath caught in her throat. It was too much, too fast, and yet every word resonated deep in her chest like the ringing of a bell. "We barely know each other," she managed to say. "Then let us fix that. Give me a chance, Maria. Give us a chance." Mason reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I am not asking you to marry me tonight. I am just asking you to let me prove that what I am feeling is real, and to see if maybe you might feel the same way." Maria looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between his sun-browned skin and her paler fingers. She thought about Theodore, who had courted her for 2 years, and never once made her feel the way Mason made her feel after just one day. She thought about her uncle, who had always told her to trust her instincts, and her instincts were screaming that this man, this unexpected savior who had walked into Patterson's store at exactly the right moment, was someone extraordinary. "Yes," she said, meeting his eyes. "Yes, I want that too." The smile that lit Mason's face was worth every risk, every bit of uncertainty. They finished their dinner in a happy bubble of conversation, oblivious to the continued stares and whispers around them. When Mason walked her back out to the wagon, the sun had set completely, leaving the sky painted in deep purples and blues, with the first stars beginning to emerge. The ride back to her ranch was quiet but comfortable, both of them lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Mason insisted on installing the repaired wheel before he left, working by lantern light while Maria held the lamp and handed him tools. It was strangely domestic, this late-night collaboration, and Maria found herself imagining a future filled with moments like this, working together, solving problems together, building something together. When Mason finished and wiped his hands clean, he walked Maria to her porch. They stood there in the darkness, the night air cool and filled with the sound of crickets. "Thank you for tonight," Maria said. "For everything. I cannot remember the last time I felt this happy." "Neither can I," Mason admitted. He reached up and tucked a stray curl behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Can I see you again tomorrow? I would like that. But do you not need to run your store? I will open in the morning, but I can close in the afternoon. I was thinking I could come out here and help you with whatever needs doing around the ranch. I want to spend time with you, Maria, and I do not mind doing it while we work." Mason grinned. "Besides, I have been behind a counter for less than a day, and I already miss being outdoors." Maria laughed. "In that case, I have about a dozen fence posts that need replacing, if you are feeling ambitious." "Ambitious is my middle name," Mason said solemnly, then ruined the effect by grinning. "I will be here by 2 o'clock." He was there at 1:30, and they spent the afternoon working together in the sun, replacing fence posts and clearing brush from the irrigation ditches. They talked constantly, the conversation flowing as easily as breathing, covering everything from politics to poetry to their favorite foods. Mason was easy to work with, never trying to take over or tell her what to do, but offering help and suggestions in a way that felt like partnership rather than instruction. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Mason opened his store early each morning, serving the customers of Colorado City with the same fair treatment he had promised. Word spread quickly that the new owner did not discriminate or judge, and slowly, tentatively, people who had felt unwelcome in Patterson's store began to trickle in. Maria saw this for herself when she came to town each week, watching as Mason greeted everyone with the same friendly courtesy, from the Chinese laundry worker to the Mexican families who lived on the south side of town. But every afternoon, like clockwork, Mason closed the store and rode out to Maria's ranch. They worked together on the endless tasks that a ranch demanded, and in the process, they fell deeper and deeper in love. Mason taught Maria how to break a green horse to saddle, how to doctor a sick calf, how to read the weather in the clouds gathering over the mountains. Maria taught Mason about literature and music, reading aloud to him in the evenings while they sat on her porch, or singing the old hymns her mother had taught her. By the time July arrived, burning and bright, the whole town knew that Mason Drake was courting Maria Hayes, and the initial scandal had given way to grudging acceptance. Some people still whispered and disapproved, but they could not deny that Mason was a good businessman and a fair man, and his obvious devotion to Maria made their disapproval seem petty and small. One evening in late July, as they sat on Maria's porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Mason took her hand and said, "Maria, I need to ask you something important." Maria's heart skipped. "What is it? How would you feel about moving into town? Not immediately, but eventually." "I have been thinking about buying the property behind the store and building a house there. A real house, with room for a family." Mason turned to face her fully. "I want to marry you, Maria. I have wanted it since that first day, but I have been trying to be patient to do this properly. But I cannot wait any longer. I love you. I love your strength and your stubbornness and your kindness. I love the way you read poetry like it is scripture, and the way you talk to your cattle like they are your children. I love waking up knowing I will see you before the day is over, and I want to spend the rest of my life waking up beside you." Tears streamed down Maria's face, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said through the tears. "Yes, I will marry you, Mason. I love you too. I love how you see the best in people, how you stand up for what is right even when it costs you. I love your hands and your smile and the way you listen like everything I say matters. I love you, and I want to build that life with you." Mason pulled her into his arms and they kissed for the first time, a long, sweet kiss that tasted of promise and forever. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "I want you to keep the ranch," he said. "We can hire someone to manage it, but I know it meant everything to your uncle, and I know it has come to mean something to you too. We will split our time between town and here, and we will make it all work somehow." "You are sure?" Maria asked. "That is a lot of complications." "Life is complicated," Mason said with a grin. "But it is worth it when you have the right person beside you." They were married 6 weeks later, in early September of 1878, in the small church that had once shunned Maria. The entire town turned out for the wedding, because by then, Mason Drake had become one of the most respected men in Colorado City, and his bride was finally receiving the acknowledgement she had always deserved. Reverend Thompson performed the ceremony, his voice solemn and clear as he pronounced them husband and wife. Maria wore a simple white dress that the seamstress who had apologized profusely for her earlier behavior had sewn specially for her. Mason wore a new black suit that made him look devastatingly handsome, and when he lifted her veil to kiss her, the whole church erupted in applause. They honeymooned at a cabin up in the mountains, spending a week lost in each other, learning the rhythms of married life. When they returned, they moved into the house Mason had built behind the store, a beautiful 2-story structure with big windows and a garden that Maria immediately began planning. The years that followed were good ones, full of hard work and deep love. Mason's store thrived, becoming the heart of the community, while Maria managed the ranch with the help of a capable foreman. Their first child, a son they named Matthew, arrived in the spring of 1880 with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. 2 years later, their daughter Rose came along, beautiful and fierce from the moment she drew her first breath. Mason never stopped making Maria his first priority. Every morning, no matter how busy the store got, he would kiss her goodbye and tell her he loved her. Every night, they sat together on their porch, talking about their day, making plans for the future, and reveling in the simple miracle of having found each other. On their 10th anniversary, as they stood on that same porch watching their children play in the yard, Maria turned to Mason and said, "Do you ever regret it, buying that store on a whim?" Mason wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled her close. "Not for a single second. That was the best $8,000 I ever spent. It bought me you, and you are worth more than all the money in the world." "That is very romantic," Maria said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Also possibly a terrible business decision." "Best terrible decision I ever made," Mason said firmly, then kissed her to prove it. Their children grew up hearing the story of how their parents met, how their father had walked into a store and fallen in love with a woman who was being treated unjustly, and how he had bought the entire store just to make things right. It became a family legend, passed down through the years, about the importance of standing up for what is right and recognizing love when it appears, even in unexpected places. Matthew grew into a fine young man who eventually took over the running of the ranch, expanding it into one of the most successful operations in the region. Rose inherited her father's business sense and her mother's love of literature, and she eventually opened a bookstore next to the general store, filling it with volumes that she imported from back east and recommended to anyone who would listen. Mason and Maria grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They watched their children marry and have children of their own. They celebrated anniversaries and holidays surrounded by family. They weathered storms and droughts and the inevitable challenges that life brings, always facing them together. On a spring morning in 1920, when they were both in their 60s, they sat on their porch, the same porch where Mason had first proposed, and looked out at the world they had built together. The general store was still standing, now run by Matthew's eldest son, and it remained a fixture of the community, a place where everyone was welcome. The ranch sprawled across the landscape, prosperous and well-maintained. Their children and grandchildren filled their lives with joy and noise and endless love. "You remember that first day?" Maria asked, her hand clasped in Mason's. Their fingers were more gnarled now, marked by age and arthritis, but their grip on each other was as strong as ever. "Every detail," Mason said. "You stood in that doorway looking like you wanted to disappear into the floor, and I thought you were the bravest person I had ever seen." "You thought I was foolish," Maria corrected with a smile, standing there taking abuse from Henry Patterson. "Brave and foolish are often the same thing," Mason said. "The point is, you did not back down and neither did I, and look what it got us." He gestured at the scene before them, their grandson playing with a stick in the yard, their granddaughter reading under the big oak tree they had planted when Matthew was born, the smoke rising from chimneys in town, the mountains standing eternal in the distance. "Not bad for a couple of stubborn fools," Maria agreed. "Not bad at all," Mason said, and he leaned over to kiss her, the same kiss they had shared 1,000 times before, familiar and precious and filled with a love that had only grown stronger with time. Years continued to pass, and they remained devoted to each other until the very end. Mason passed first, in his sleep one winter night, with Maria holding his hand and whispering all the things she loved about him. She followed him 3 years later, and they were buried side by side in the cemetery overlooking Colorado City, their headstones marking them as beloved parents, grandparents, and partners in life. But their story did not end there. It lived on in the memories of their children and grandchildren, in the store that still served the community fairly, in the ranch that still bore the Hayes name. It lived on in the example they had set of what real love looked like, not the fairy tale kind that appears in an instant and requires no work, but the real kind that is built day by day through small acts of kindness and devotion. The people of Colorado City never forgot the story of how Mason Drake had bought an entire store just to defend a woman who was being treated unjustly, and how that single act of courage and compassion had led to one of the greatest love stories their town had ever known. They told it to their children, who told it to their children, until it became part of the town's history, a reminder that love and justice and standing up for what is right are never wasted efforts. And in the end, that was the true legacy of Mason and Maria, not the store or the ranch or the children they raised, but the proof that sometimes, when the world is cruel and unjust, all it takes is one person willing to stand up and say, "This is wrong," to change everything. That one act of defiance, of choosing love over prejudice and courage over comfort, can ripple out through time and touch more lives than anyone could ever imagine. Their story became a testament to the power of love found in unexpected places, of second chances and new beginnings, of refusing to accept injustice even when everyone else has made their peace with it. It was a story about two people who found each other at exactly the right moment, who recognized in each other the possibility of something extraordinary, and who had the courage to reach for it, even though the whole world seemed to be against them. And every time someone walked into that general store in Colorado City, now run by the fourth generation of the Drake family, they walked into a place that had been founded on the principle that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. That principle, established by Mason Drake on a hot June day in 1878, never wavered. The store remained a place where everyone was welcome, where a person's money was as good as anyone else's, and where prejudice had no place. The ranch, too, remained in the family, a beautiful piece of land where the cattle grazed and the crops grew, and the Hayes-Drake legacy continued to flourish. Matthew's children and grandchildren worked that land with pride, always remembering the woman who had fought to keep it when everyone said she should give up and go back east where she belonged. On warm summer evenings, when the sun set over Pikes Peak and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, you could sometimes see couples sitting on porches throughout Colorado City, holding hands and watching the day fade into night. And maybe, if you listened carefully, you could hear echoes of Mason and Maria, still sitting on their porch after all these years, still talking and laughing and planning for a future they would build together. Their love story became the standard by which all others were measured in that town. When young people fell in love, their elders would smile and say, "Maybe they will be like Mason and Maria." When someone stood up against injustice, people would nod approvingly and say, "That is something Mason Drake would have done." The story became part of the town's identity, a piece of its soul. And so the years turned into decades, and the decades turned into a century, but the story remained. It remained because it was true, because it was powerful, and because it reminded everyone who heard it that love is worth fighting for, that justice is worth defending, and that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. In the end, Mason Drake did not just buy a store that day in June 1878. He bought a future, a family, and a love that would echo through generations. And Maria Hayes did not just walk into a store looking for flour and coffee. She walked into her destiny, into the arms of a man who would love her fiercely and faithfully for the rest of his life, who would stand beside her through every challenge and celebrate every triumph. Their story was not perfect, no real story ever is. There were arguments and disappointments, hard times and heartaches. But through it all, they held onto each other, and that made all the difference. They proved that love is not about finding a perfect person, but about choosing to love an imperfect person perfectly. They showed that the strongest foundations are built not in moments of passion, but in the quiet, steady accumulation of days spent working side by side, supporting each other, and choosing each other over and over again. And when their great-great-grandchildren sat around dinner tables in homes scattered across Colorado and beyond, and someone asked them to tell the story of how their family began, they would smile and lean forward and say, "Well, it all started when a shopkeeper would not serve her, and a cowboy bought the store and made her the first customer always." And then they would tell the whole beautiful story, keeping alive the memory of two people who had loved each other so well that their love became immortal. The general store still stands in Colorado City, a testament to the power of one person's decision to do the right thing. The ranch still spreads across the valley, fertile and productive. And somewhere in the space between memory and legend, Mason and Maria are still together, still in love, still proving that the best stories are the ones that are true.